Hi, Andrew Cuneo here with a different kind of video today. Sadly, I've been eliminated from the Innistrad Crimson Vow set championships, but before I was eliminated, I did get to play 7 rounds, 3 rounds of Historic and 4 rounds of Standard. I'm going to show you what I think was definitely the coolest game I played, which was in Historic. And let's start by taking a look at the deck I played. It's an Izzet control deck that has Torrential Gearhulks and Magma Opuses. I played this a lot on my stream. I like this deck a lot in Historic. I think it's pretty good. It's a lot of people play this as more of a Jeskai deck, but I don't really think the white actually helps you at all. I think it just gives you worse mana. So this is the deck. I'm not going to go super deep into it. I might do a different video on that. Then my opponent's deck, I was playing against Nameless Thing, who I think is a Chinese player, and he's playing Jund Food. There's a couple of oddball cards in the list. There's 2 copies of Old Rutstein, which I'm not really sold that that's a good inclusion in the deck. I mean, it gives you a bunch of fodder to sacrifice if that's what you feel the deck is lacking, so maybe that's why it's included here. Not really sure, not a super powerful card. Then there's also 1 copy of Kroxa in the sideboard, which is also a little bit odd for this style of deck, but Kroxa is a very good card against my deck, so that was giving me a little bit of concern. We're going to jump into the match in Game 2, so I'm going to start out by showing you guys how I sideboarded. I basically sideboard the same against all of the food decks. I bring in Aether Gust and Ratchet Bomb and Abrade to have more answers to Trail of Crumbs and to Witch's Oven. And then I trim the Shark Typhoon just because it's not a particularly good card in the matchup, and I trim the Lanterns because they generally don't do anything. It's really, really hard to catch a Cauldron Familiar with a Lantern. That's the same reason I don't bring in more copies of Anger of the Gods. It doesn't generally work out that you get to exile the Cauldron Familiar. Pundit's taking a little bit more time sideboarding. I'm sure they're going to bring in the Kroxa and another Thoughtseize. I don't really have a great sense of what they might be trimming in their deck. I tend to think Mayhem Devil is one of their weaker cards. I mean, certainly they're gonna remove Fatal Push, but after that, I don't know exactly what they're gonna do. People seem to board in a variety of ways. That's one of the experiences you get when you tend to play rogue decks, is you really can't necessarily anticipate how your opponent's going to sideboard against you, because it's likely your opponent's never played against a deck that is exactly like yours. So they're going to behave somewhat erratically or unpredictably. And give them a second to finish sideboarding. So this, the video that's up on the screen is my webcam from when I was actually playing. I'm recording this after the fact. I was trying to concentrate on the matches, so I wasn't doing commentary, but I don't know, I thought that it might be fun to, maybe I have some goofy facial expressions throughout the match. Hopefully I don't do anything too embarrassing, but we'll find out. All right, we're ready to go, finally. So I'm going to get to be on the play. I lost the first game. First game I lost, they had all 4 copies of Trail of Crumbs by like turn 6. So it was kind of a slaughter. This is good hand. Like, I've got Aether Gust, which is an important answer to Trail of Crumbs, although it does only delay it. I'm on the play, so I can potentially censor Trail of Crumbs, which is a pretty big deal. I'm a little landlight, but I do have an Expressive Iteration, which is great for dealing with landlight hands. So I'm going to get Thoughtseized here, and I think it's pretty clear that they should take Expressive Iteration, which they do. I don't draw a land, which is a little bit sad. So here I'm going to have 3 choices. I can Aether Gust to play potentially. I can censor something. or I can cycle. And if I choose to cycle, I can cycle either Shark Typhoon or Censor. But it's going to depend entirely on what they do with their turn. So they play a Ravenous Squirrel. I'm definitely going to want to kill that before it gets going too much. But I want to make my land drop next turn, so I definitely want to cycle. And I'm potentially still going to get value out of censoring something. Works out pretty good for me there that I cycle into an untapped land, so I get to play my Unholy Heat on the Squirrel, and I've got Censor and Aether Gust up still. Even though they know I have the Censor, it's so early on the game that leaving it up still does restrict how they can develop their board. They need to respect it. Maybe if they don't give me an opportunity to censor this turn, I might decide to give up on it and cycle. Another squirrel. The squirrels are scary. They're not the scariest thing, but they can get pretty out of hand, so I'm going to go ahead and Aether Gust this. Also, I'm just trying to buy time so that I can make my land drops. I get kind of lucky there and I draw a land. So now I've got access to commit, and I've still got my Censor. You tend to get pecked away at in this matchup that they're not that good at burning you out, but eventually the game, eventually if they get Cat Oven, all the incremental damage is going to start adding up. I'm still at a healthy life total, so it's not a huge concern yet, but the fact that I'm taking one from a turn from the Cauldron Familiar is not nothing. I finally decided to cycle the Censor. I think my thought process here was, I definitely want to just make sure I get to Gearhulk on turn 6. My hand's, not doing anything particularly powerful if I don't get to do that. I'm definitely going to look to commit something here. The fact that I played the Steam Vents tapped means that the only way I can spend my mana is on commit. I could have either played the island, so I'd have the option of using Castle Vantress, or shock the Steam Vents. I didn't want to shock just because, like I was saying, the incremental damage does add up, and the way this game is developing, it looks like I'm going to be taking 1 or 2 a turn for the foreseeable future. So I don't want to, wind up stabilizing in a spot where I'm stabilized, but I'm at 3 life. So now every Cauldron Familiar is potentially a really big problem, and every treasure every food they get to bring back a Cauldron Familiar it's potentially a huge issue. Here, it looks like they're pausing because they're planning to sack the Cauldron Familiar to the Squirrel. It's kind of a timing tell in how they do things. I don't know that helped me that much. But here I'm going to make a play that you don't make hardly ever, but I'm going to do a draw step Gearhulk Memory to give them 7 cards and give me 7 new cards. So they're starting with 4 cards in hand and a Cauldron Familiar in their graveyard, and I had 1 card in hand. So I'm ahead at this point in terms of kind of raw resources that I've gotten to expend before the memory, because I've gotten 7 cards into play and they've only gotten 6. But they're going to get to use the new hand first, which is a pretty big advantage. My 7-card hand isn't great. I mean, I've already got 6 lands in play, so I was hoping to see fewer than 3 lands, I think, in my hand. Also, I drew the Shark Typhoon, which is really not that good of a card in this matchup. And, Anger and Unholy Heat both kind of do the same thing. Opponent's taking a long time to process their hand, so I've got plenty of time to stretch. I do have the Aether Gust in hand, so one of the scariest cards they could resolve at this point is a Corvald. I've got a Gust for that. They also, if they could just go like Trail of Crumbs, Cat Oven here, which wouldn't be that crazy with 7 new cards, that would also be basically a huge problem. I think I'd be a pretty big underdog if they have Cat Oven Trail here. They just have Binding of the Old Gods, which is a card I'm kind of surprised they even have in their deck, if I'm being honest. They have a Trail, but no Cat or Oven this turn at least. Here I'm going to make a very strange play, but it's born of the fact that I feel like my hand is actually pretty weak for the situation, so I resolved the Shark Typhoon rather than just cycling it because I think it's a max upside play. If I had had a stronger hand, I probably would have just played to cycle it. Also, I made a minor mistake. I think I definitely should have cracked the Fabled Passage there rather than play the island, just to thin a land out of my deck. I think the opponent's list had 3 copies of Binding of the Old Gods. Definitely if they played a Binding of the Old Gods this turn and got rid of the Shark Typhoon, I would just be in awful shape. I kind of made the assumption that they weren't going to have all of their copies of Binding of the Old Gods in the matchup. And here we've got their one of Kroxa, which is kind of an oddball inclusion in their deck. I don't think I can really afford to discard a spell here to save the damage, just because I have so few spells in my hand and so many lands. And I draw another land. That's definitely not great. Got an Anger to get the Mayhem Devil off the board, which is fine. Gusting the Trail of Crumbs before they untapped really wouldn't do anything there. They would just leave it on top and replay it. I would just be trading my 2 mana for their 2 mana, which isn't a great spot, or isn't a great thing to do in this spot. Here, now that they're casting the Cauldron Familiar, the fact that they've got Oven in play is going to allow them to use their Trail more efficiently, because now they have the cat as a 1 mana way to sack the food. So I'm going to go ahead and Aether Gust with the Familiar on the stack. It's a little bit hard to tell in the replay exactly how many cards they have in their graveyard, but it's not that many, so the Kroxa is not an immediate problem, but it's going to be a problem pretty quickly. Things have started looking pretty grim, I would say. Like, I don't have an answer to the Trail, I don't have an answer to Cat Oven, and there's this Kroxa that's hanging over my head. And in theory, I can start doing damage pretty quickly with Shark Typhoon, but I don't even have any spells. So there, I decided to not scry in my upkeep because I do have 3 Magma Opuses left in my deck, and that would be one of my better draws. So I didn't want to scry and then not be able to cast it. Also, Torrential Gearhulks would be one of my better draws. And that would be another card that if I scried in my upkeep, I wouldn't have been able to use that turn. I thought I was in bad enough shape that I had to just hope to get lucky and draw a card I could play that turn. And I wanted to make sure that all of my really high impact cards were going to be available to me. So my life total's really starting to get low now. They've got Cat Oven, and I've only got 7 life left. And they also have the 2 cats, so like they're potentially going to get to attack and deal a little bit of damage at some point. I do get to Gust the Trail again, which is nice both in that it keeps the trail off the board for another turn, and it is one less card that's going to their graveyard, so it's delaying the Kroxa a little bit. It's kind of odd that they're pausing here, but I think what they're considering doing is animating their Hive of the Eye Tyrant and just attacking with all of their creatures just to get the Hive of the Eye Tyrant into the graveyard to have another card in their graveyard for Kroxa. And that appears to be what they were thinking. And that's the only way this attack really makes any sense. So I'm going to double block the Hive of the Eye Tyrant, because even though I don't want to give them I'm kind of giving them what they want, I just can't take 3 damage from the Hive of the Eye Tyrant. They make a mistake here, and they've misordered blockers, so they just deal 3 to the Torrential Gearhulk for no reason instead of killing a shark, and they also don't sack their cat that's going to be dying anyway to the oven, which that might not be a mistake, because they could potentially get both cats in the yard with the Hive of the Eye Tyrant and bring back the Kroxa. I scried there because I really wanted an Archmage's Charm. And also, I no longer even have any good cards left in my graveyard for the Torrential Gearhulk, so there's that as well. Maybe mistimed the casting of this Archmage's Charm a little bit. I maybe should have just let them block. I think I gave them more choices than I needed to, although it doesn't really matter the way the game plays out. So I managed to break up Cat Oven here. They've still got a trail on top of their deck, but they don't have an endless source of food anymore. And also, I've assembled kind of a cool combo of I can make sharks and sack them to the oven to get food to gain life. Normally my deck can't gain life, but I've used Archmage's Charm to construct a recurring life gain element, which is pretty important given that I'm at 5 life and they've got a Kroxa and they have 2 Cauldron Familiars in their graveyard. I think if I remember right, they might have been able to exile both of their Cauldron Familiars there to bring the Kroxa back. They could either do that or they were 1 card off. Either way, they chose not to do it because they had to get old Rutstein in play. Which, one thing old Rutstein does do is it does feed the Kroxa, so the Kroxa has now become an even bigger problem. I bottomed the Narset there, which was maybe a mistake. My thought process was kind of, I'd really, really like to have another Archmage's Charm next turn to stop the Kroxa from coming into play. So I was scrying for absolute max upside there. I decided not to attack at all here because I didn't want to take any chip damage from their creatures. And they can bring the Kroxa back before combat, which will force me to sack a shark and then sack the food. So they would be able to deal at least 1 damage to me with their 4 creatures in play if they bring the Kroxa back before combat. So here comes the Kroxa. I decided to sack the Torrential Gearhulk just so I can get 2 food. Because I don't think that I'm ever going to be able to successfully attack with it on the ground when they've got the Cauldron Familiars and Old Rutstein. Like, I think the Flyers are more likely to deal damage. This is going to make it a little harder for me to actually trade with Kroxa in combat, but I felt like I just needed the life as well. So they've reassembled Cat Oven Trail, which is not good for me. So I'm thinking for a while to decide what am I going to do with my Blast Zone. I could Blast Zone for 1 to get the Cauldron Familiars off the board before the Oven comes out, but then they can just Oven away the Insect token, and so that doesn't really do anything. I also need to decide, do I want to sack a food here, or do I want to charge up the Blast Zone to 2? And I decide to charge the Blast Zone up to 2 because it's more mana efficient. Although this does lock me into the idea that I'm going to be Blast Zoning away the Trail and the Kroxa rather than the Oven. So it's not 100% obvious that this is the way to go. They can do 1 damage to me at instant speed because of the Oven Cat combo. So here I have another great top deck, which again I didn't scry in my upkeep because I thought that I needed to have access to my mana. Which, like, part of the reason I didn't scry is because I thought that for a lot of my draws I would wind up just Blast Zoning for 2 in this spot. So now I've got a lot of choices about how I do this Magma Opus. I'm going to have to access to 3 mana after I Opus. So I could maybe, like, Opus now, and if I drew a Narset, I could cast it. But ultimately, you just saw me set a stop on their upkeep. At least I think I did. Looks like I was trying to click to do that. So I'm going to wind up Opusing in their upkeep. Don't really understand why they just didn't use their Oven. Didn't make it. That doesn't really make any sense not to have used the Oven on my instep. So this is another food source, but not really that big of a deal. I do wind up killing the goose just because it's better, I think, than doing 2 damage to them. And I'm going to tap Kroxa because obviously I don't want it to attack. And I tap the Oven now just to cut down on their ability to potentially use it in some way on my turn. One thing that is going on through the course of this game, if you look in the top left, my opponent's down to 6.5 minutes on their clock. So I do think they've made a couple of missteps, and I think that they're starting to feel a little bit of pressure from the clock, potentially. This has been a a long and pretty intricate game where I think they probably felt they had me very close to beat a number of times, and I've drawn well, that is 100% what happened. So this is great. I drew an Archmage's Charm and an Unholy Heat. I have a choice. I can use the Unholy Heat to kill old Rutstein. I can save it to potentially kill a Kroxa if it comes back. Or I can save it for a Korvald, which they have yet to draw a Korvald this game. I think their deck had 3 copies of Korvald in it. They make this suicide attack with their cats, which is just to get to activate Trail. But my life total is so low that I kind of decided I don't want to just let them deal free damage to me. Also, they have access to a lot of lands, so it's not like I'm really preventing them from using Trail. I'm just saving them a little bit of mana when they've got a lot of mana. Now I pause because I'm thinking about maybe I want to use the Unholy Heat to kill the squirrel. And if you see my cursor moving around, I'm trying to count to make sure I can actually kill the squirrel if I fire off Unholy Heat right now, because they've got 2 blood they can sack, they've got another food they can sack, and then they can also spend mana to sack like a cat, or they could sack old Rutstein even. I think if I count it right, they can only sack 4 times. So the Unholy Heat's definitely good here. I think the opponent's probably doing that same math right now. They might also just be deciding if they just want to sack a cat just to get a card, which is what they've decided to do. It's kind of crazy that I've had Shark Typhoon in play for so many turns, and I've made so many sharks, and I still don't really feel like I'm winning at this point. I feel like I'm in okay shape, whereas there were a bunch of turns a little while back where I thought I was like, I needed to top deck or I was going to lose. So my situation has improved, but I wouldn't say I'm really in control of the game at this point. And I'm not sure what the graveyard count is, but the Crocs has got to be about ready to come back again. Definitely want to make a food with the oven while I've got the chance. It's just a matter of, do I want to sack the 1/1 or do I want to sack the 4/4 and get 2 food? I decided to just sack the 1/1. Not really sure why I decided to attack with the 4/4 on the ground. That seems like a pretty clear mistake on my part. I guess my thought process was I knew I was going to be stealing the oven. So this kind of forces them to use the Trail of Crumbs with the cat now. Well, it doesn't even really force me. I think that my play just didn't make any sense. I'm just going ahead and taking all of these game actions right now because I'm empty-handed, so my hands just face up. I guess I do have the option of using the Blast Zone here. But I kind of decide that it's not even worth blast zoning away the one Trail of Crumbs at this point when they've got the Kroxa in their graveyard I can blast zone, and the Trail of Crumbs isn't even doing that much. So now they've got a Corval in play, and they've got a lot of stuff to sack. So this is another perilous situation, I would say. I do have my life gain engine is fully online, though. Because I don't remember if the search is about to flip. Feels like it's probably about to flip, but they have the Soul Guide Lantern in play, so maybe they sack the Soul Guide Lantern to stop it from flipping. They even got the Corval in play, so if they sack the Soul Guide Lantern, they get a card. They found a second Trail of Crumbs. Oh no, the Binding of the Old Gods. And here they make a play that is not good. Killing the 8/8 over the Shark Typhoon really didn't make any sense, I would have to say. Find another Magma Opus on top of my deck. I maybe... Yeah, I guess I really couldn't have attacked there. At this point, the opponent's clock has gotten so low that I don't even really need to win this game. I need to just not lose, and I'll win the match. So there's not really any upside in taking kind of risky attacks. All right, Crocs is making another appearance, so I'm going to cast the Magma Opus rather than discard it, obviously. I'm going to finally kill old Rutstein. I think I decide to just counter the Kroxa because I don't really feel like there's much they could have in their hand that I would otherwise want to counter. So I don't want to just discard my Expressive Iteration. Also, I'm at 11 life, so I don't really need to save mana for making and sacking of food. They're really far away from being able to potentially kill me with a Mayhem Devil. I think I saw one Mayhem Devil this game, but I've seen a lot of their deck. I'd be surprised if they had 4 Mayhem Devils in their deck. We get a replacement Corval that draws some cards. You know it's going to be a good turn when you start with 2 Expressive Iterations in your hand and you've got 1,000,000 mana. Maybe mess up by not taking the land there. Ultimately, I decide that this turn that I basically can't lose the match as long as I just leave mana up to sack the food and make sure I'm able to cast Archmage's Charm, so I just don't even play the cards off of Expressive Iteration. So I definitely would have been better off having taken a land I could play, the Fabled Passage. They're going to Thoughtseize me. And I could counter it, which really wouldn't be particularly exciting. I could just choose to draw 2 cards in response, and that way I'm at least up a card. Or I can just let it happen and save 2 more mana for sacking food, because remember, I can sack 2 sharks, so I can go up to potentially 4 food, even though I've only got enough mana to sack 3. And Crocs is back again. I just choose to discard the Unholy Heat rather than killing an insect or a Cauldron Familiar. I continue to play this turn just in the try to just take 0 damage so you don't lose to Mayhem Devil in some sort of crazy fashion. I do still have the Blast Zone on 2, so if I want, I could kill the Crocs and both of the Trail of Crumbs here. That would destroy my own search for Azcanta. I think we're sort of past the point in the game where the Trail and the Crocs would really matter. So I'm just going to gain a bunch of life. Also, the search is going to flip, so I could just Blast Zone on my turn. I don't know why I think that was the 7th card to allow the search to flip. That's why I put the Expressive Iteration in the graveyard. As it turns out, though, my opponent is just dead on board to flyers.